Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a game from the 2012 U.S. Chess Championship Tournament between the number 1 ranked U.S. player, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, and the 8th ranked U.S. player, Grandmaster Ray Robson. This game features an always popular king walk in this round 3 matchup. So let's have a look. We have on the white end, Nakamura kicking off with e4, and Ray Robson replying with the Sicilian, c5. After knight f3, d6 and d4, we're entering an open Sicilian, which is denoted by the exchange of those pawns. And after knight f6, knight c3, g6, heading for a dragon variation of the Sicilian. And if at this point you don't already view this bishop, the dark square bishop for black, as carrying a much greater value than, let's say, the typical rough estimate of 3 points, you should. Because without him around, this king can very easily get ripped to shreds. The bishop on g7 will serve as both an aggressive piece as well as a defensive piece. You'll note that with that g6 move, both f6 and h6 have been compromised. Hanging on to that guy is going to be very important, especially since a typical idea is a queenside castle and the launching of this h-pawn, trying to peel open the h-file, trying to engage with g6, and before you know it, the the h-rook comes right to life. So, very important to keep in mind already at this very early point, because come mid-game, there's an important move that I believe takes into account the exchange of the dark square bishops, and I'll touch on that when the time comes. But first things first, more development. Bishop e3, Yugoslav attack, looking for this type of exchange, lining up the queen and bishop, forming that battery, trying to get a bishop maybe to h6, exchange those dark square bishops off. Bishop g7, f3, prevents knight g4 nonsense, kicking that dark square bishop away. Knight c6, queen d2, black castles, and now g4 just coming right after black, looking to open up the h-file or g-file, and also preventing some strike in the center with d5. That is one thing that you kind of could view g4 as doing. Another move to see on this move 9 for white is castle queenside, and after that we could see d5 striking in the center. g4 prevents this because of d5. We have the classic in-between move with g5, and only after the knight moves away do we capture on d5, and white simply nets a pawn. So we don't have that. We're not going to see that after g4. We're not going to see d5, but rather bishop e6, that's what was played. After knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, only then is queenside castled played. Now, one other variation to be aware of, and I'm not sure how common it is, but bishop takes pawn here, pawn takes bishop, knight takes is maybe a little bit scary for white. If you're not, let's say, booked up on this, if you're not familiar with these next handful of moves that white should be running with, maybe this is something to be avoiding on this move 9 with g4. Because, white is still not yet castled. There is just knight takes bishop happening maybe, and, there's pressure on this knight. The queen could be coming out to one of these two squares, b6, a5. Soon enough, you'll be seeing a rook play to the c-file. It may turn out that white is really needing to come up with some defensive resources here. So just be aware of this possibility right here in response to g4 right here. There is this a potential sacrifice, this potential minor piece sacrifice. We're not having that. Instead, bishop e6, we do have this exchange, only then queenside castle comes about. So if you're still fixated in a chess game about these doubled pawns, don't really view them as a liability here. This guy right here serving a good role, watches over d5. This knight's not going to be making use of that anytime soon, and this bishop has now sprung to life on this f-file as a result of f takes e. So knight e5 hits at both f3 and has a close eye on c4. c4 being the weakest point on the white side versus the Sicilian. And you really need to, if you're going to be playing the white side against the Sicilian, you really do need to take into account a knight move to that square and have a bishop around in order to watch over it. This pawn right here does not want to move. You move that pawn, you're weakening your dark squares, and this bishop's eyes light right up. And so too would this rook's and even the queen. So this guy, stay put. It's the bishop's role to watch over c4. And so that's why we're not having, let's say, a move like bishop here. It's got to go to e2. That's the way to meet the threat on f3 and keep an eye on c4. Queen c8, focusing on c4, trying to get a knight there. This is the more, it would seem like the more natural move, just having the rooks in direct contact with one another. But black is just wanting to sidestep any knight b5 stuff with tempo. So queen c8 does the trick. Main idea, get to c4 with the knight. And after h4, we have what I thought would be knight to c4, but it's not played. Instead, we have knight f to d7, and this is the point that I was emphasizing earlier on regarding the dark square bishops. Now, this is a moment where I certainly took pause. When I first reviewed this game, I thought, what's going on here? Because it seems like when you're making moves like knight to e5, that's what we have on move 11, knight e5. On move 12, queen to c8. Move 13, just following up with these two prep moves, you would think you just, swing the bat completely around, follow through with this knight c4 move. But all of a sudden we have just knight on f to d7. So I had to figure out reasons. It's just something I do when I'm not sure of like why a particular move wasn't played. And this is what caught my attention. I'm wondering, well, why this move instead of knight to c4? And then I began to question things. I ran with it. What would happen if knight was played there? Well, definitely has to be taken. That knight on c4, again, is intolerable. After the queen exchange, what do you know? We do have this. I'm not saying it's best, but we do have this as a possibility for white. The dark square bishops will come off the board, and this h-file is going to be opened up, and this king, I think, is going to find it very difficult to have any good defensive resource. So, what's different? What's different about having this knight play to d7? Well, first and foremost, there's an issue now with f3. And white, I guess, could respond with rook to h3, devoting a rook to the defense of a pawn, but that's a little bit shaky because we're in a position where we're trying to meet punches with counter punches. And if there's a punch being thrown at f3, we don't want to just make a strictly defensive move. The knee-jerk reaction, or at least the mentality to get into in a dynamic position like this, opposite sides castling, we have the Sicilian dragon, a very aggressive opening. The knee-jerk reaction should really be to meet a punch with the counterpunch. And so the reaction against f3 was f4. That's what was played in the game. Attack against f3, counterpunch. I'm throwing something back at your knight. You react. And the knight, only at this point did the knight react with knight c4. And you'll note that after this exchange, it's much different because this move, bishop h6, is not available. We have a pawn on f4. So this is just a little minor detail that takes into account that earlier idea of the bishop carrying a great weight as both an aggressive piece as well as a defensive piece for that black king. So anyhow, after queen takes bishop, pressing forward first in the center, trying to exploit this knight's position, being that it's unprotected on d7, as well as shutting down this bishop from seeing any of these squares over here on the queen side. So knight b6, h5, and I can assure you white doesn't even think about taking this knight right here. There's no need to be fixated on, let's say, doubled pawn structure. Who cares about pawn structure in this type of position when it comes to attacking one another's kings? You don't want to help your opponent bring their pieces to life. You want to go after your opponent's king. So instead, just h5, follow through. You didn't come to h4 to just sit there. You came there so you go to h5, open up the h file. And that's what we have. H takes g, h takes g, and now queen to h2, looking for that h7 square. Rook takes pawn, giving up the rook in order to save this king. So he's not as accessible right here. And what we enter is an interesting imbalanced endgame. I don't know that there's really a whole lot that comes about after the queen h7 move. Instead, what we do have is bishop takes rook, queen takes with check, and not queen takes queen, but rather king to b1. There's no need to just run for queen takes queen and help black out in two ways. One, undoubling of pawns, and two, the bishop can now see the world. So instead, just king to b1 after the queen recaptures on f4, king b1, and now it's very important to get the queens off, because this rook does have the potential to control f7 with mate right around the corner. Queens need to come off. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and here we are. If you just count up the points here, these pawns maybe, okay, yeah, looking a little bit ugly right here, but some precise endgame technique is needed here. So let's see how things play out. We have a minor piece and two pawns against the rook situation. Okay, again, not so healthy right here with these three, but nevertheless, this is what we see. We have rook f8, open file. Let's get there. Knight e4. Taking stock of the position right here, what would you do? Would you get into the routine of, let's say, doubling rooks here? Would you come over here thinking that there's something against the king? There's not. Doubling rooks right here is not going in the correct direction. The piece that needs the most work is this guy. So that's what white starts doing. Knight e4, getting it centered. Rook f4, knight g5. This pawn falls, but this pawn falls, and is hitting this bishop, which is important to hang on to because he will still act as an important piece in this position, one which I think kind of glues these pawns together, one which provides, let's say, some coordination for these two pawns in particular, having a bishop on f6, which is what was played, bishop f6 right here. And what can happen very soon if white is not accurate, this king could start to play a very active role in helping to facilitate these pawns. As weak as they look, they are passed, and they could just start pushing forward. We do have the rook, the bishop, and the king that can help out. So b3, two things going on. c4 is still being watched over, and just this prep move right here as well, trying to get in c4. And, well, this is a majority. White is trying to get a passed pawn and have black react in some way to that threat of promotion. So the knight goes back to c8, c4, knight d6. You might have thought, why not throw in a check? Here's the reason why. Really, it just turns out to be both knights coming off the board, and what has just happened? White has helped the black king out. The king would much rather be on e6 than g8. He's in a much better spot, one step closer to helping support these pawns towards this, promotion rank here. So we're not having that. Instead of the rook check, c4, knight d6, repositioning moves, c5, pressing forward, and now only after the knight plays to b5, rook d7, throwing a piece right there on that 7th rank, eyeing b7. As soon as he's gone, this guy is just a few moves away from scoring a touchdown. King f7, rook takes pawn, and we have a rook check. So it's a little bit different here. White just won this pawn. This guy is now passed. So if king takes knight, we just have rook takes knight, and that's going to be good for white. So we don't have that. Instead, rook check, and very important right now is, we see a series of moves here where it's very important for black to be accurate with where they step with their king. King to c2. If you go to b2, you lose. How do you lose? You lose with first e4, discover check, king c2, knight a3 gets out of the rook takes knight, and only after king moves, king takes knight. Two minor pieces. This pawn isn't going to go anywhere. This rook will be around to maybe grab it, or the king. This pawn is passed. Things are good for black. Black is doing better here and winning. So certainly something to be avoided. You don't go to b2, you go to c2. You allow a knight check, and that's what was played, knight a3. The king comes back to b2 only at this point, knowing if pawn check, you could at least get a knight out of it. You're not losing a piece, in other words. So the knight gives a check, king comes back to b2. Knight b1. Now the knight reacts to the king's threat. Knight check. Again, typical counterpunch. Okay, knight hits the king reacts, hits the knight. The knight has to react, it's putting pressure on this pawn. Well, really that's the only safe square that you could be going. Otherwise, you're just kind of dancing back and forth on these e6 and d8 squares. And now the pawn pushes with check. King goes to c2, knight a3, king to d2. The white king is basically going on a tightrope right here. King d2, knight b1, king e3, rook e1, king f2, rook c1, and finally throwing another rook on that 7th rank, converging on this e7 pawn for what is now a 3rd time. This king so far has, after castle, it's played to c2, b2, c2, d2, e3, f2, but it's not done yet. After rook to c2, king g3, and now we have rook to c3, which is maybe not the best way to put up resistance in this position. I was looking at it a bit more closely. Instead of rook c3, there is knight to c3, trying to get it in a spot where there's maybe knight e2 check, and it does prevent knight takes e7. In the game, after rook c3 was played and king g4, we saw e3 followed by knight takes on e. However, instead of the rook c3 move, if knight c3 is played, knight takes pawn is not available. Black is actually winning if this move is played. It's very important for this knight to serve the role of watching over e5. When you take on e7, you're no longer guarding that square, and you allow for bishop e5, and this king is running very short on squares. If you play to the h-file, you allow for rook h2, and your rook is picked off, and really there's no way to prevent that. King g4 is only delaying it for a move. It still allows for rook g2, pick your favorite square, king h2, and the rook is dead, and so too is Team White. So, very important to note this particular move and how it maybe could put up a little bit more resistance. There's still stuff that White could be doing, maybe getting the b pawn involved, maybe grabbing the a pawn. Maybe after the a pawn is grabbed, the white a pawn could be contributing in some way, etc. But it wasn't played. Instead of knight c3, we had rook c3 with check. The king's still going on his little journey here. e3, pressing forward, just a couple moves away from queening. Knight takes e, and now e2. It seems like we're just going to have a successful queen, but white is just calculated a bit further. And this game finishes up in a really neat way. We have knight d5, not just to land a fork, but really the main idea is a mate in 2 threat. If you queen right now, it's just going to be knight takes bishop, and depending on where the king goes, one of these two is going to be mate next. So we don't have pawn promotion just yet, but rather a sneaky move right here, rook g3. You take the rook, you end up losing. This is queen with check, very important detail. White at best could only hope for, let's say, a perpetual check, but it's much worse than that. There's 2 things that need to be taken into account. White would be needing to sidestep 2 things. Preventing bishop to e5 check at some point, where from the e5 square it would take into account both rook threat moves right here, both rook moves with checkmate, and the other thing to try to avoid is queen captures knight at some point with check. One of those 2 will end up happening, and shortly thereafter the white king will end up mated. So we don't have king takes rook, in other words. King to f4 is played. Bishop g5 check. You still don't take the rook. Instead, king to e5, walking into a position where the pawn can promote with check, and that's what was played. King to d6, and now there's simply nothing that black can do. They've pretty much given all the successful checks that they could, and there's nothing good here. The game does finish up in the following way. We do have bishop f4, and king here should not be played. Queen d6, that's something to certainly avoid right here. You just grab that bishop, and although the king is exposed along this d file, there's, again, not a successful check that you can be running with. If the queen gives check, the knight just plays here. And again, nothing good is going to happen. These two threats are maintained. So what we did see is, or what was tried, is a rook check, knight takes rook, queen g3 check, knight e5, and without any other successful checks available, black is forced into resignation at this point. So a really interesting game. I think those types of games, whenever there's a king walk, it's always very interesting. It turned out after castle, the king did play first to c2, b2, c2, d2, e3, f2, g3, g4, f4, e5, d6, and finally, once this position came about, with the knight in close proximity to this white king, it will serve as a wonderful defensive piece against queen checks. There's nothing more that black can do but throw in the towel. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.